We're keen to get started. Firstly, thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us. We'll get into an official, the official agenda and what we're here to talk about shortly, but just a couple of intros and housekeeping to start. So welcome everyone. I'm Heidi, co-founder of Mentorloop. We help organizations run more accessible mentoring programs for their people and communities. Thank you for joining us today alongside my fellow colleagues and people experts, Alana Bennett and Christian Miran, where we'll be unpacking Stop Future-Proofing Your Workforce and Start Future Building. But before we officially get into it, I just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today, wherever you may be dialing in from. So thank you. So we'll get rid of those slides there. Bring it back to the people part. Again, welcome Alana, welcome Chris. I'm sure the audience that we have joining us today has done the standard stalk on LinkedIn and familiar with the bios. So I thought before we get into really, unpacking the topic that we've presented today, I'd love to start with just getting a little bit of a share, which may unpack a bit of a personal insight from you, but keen to have a quick hello and maybe share with us what's something that you're currently learning. And for me, I thought I'd throw it there. I'm still learning how to host webinars properly, but a few teething issues.
It started well. You do well.
It did.
So
it did.
I think I do need to go back to the rule book on hosting webinars after this. But Alana, if you want to kick us off, that'd be a great place to start.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. So thrilled to be here today. What am I learning at the moment? I'm actually learning how to play tennis. And anyone that perhaps is on the call that knows me knows that my little boys are very, very good tennis players. And I decided that I needed to learn how to play to keep up with them. It is really hard as an adult to learn a new skill, right? And I think that's the massive caveat for this conversation is this is hard work. I do love it. I do often have to say to them, don't hit me a really hard ball or don't aim at me. So actually I can get it back to you. Heidi, I know you will appreciate that as a tennis fan too. So that's me. Over to you, Chris.
Hey, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm learning how to dunk a basketball at the moment, actually. So my kids play basketball. Maybe a bit of a theme there, Alana. And I'm just a dad really trying to impress his kids, basically. So they always have asked me if I could dunk, and I never could say yes. So before I turned 41, my goal is to be able to dunk. Amazing. So I've been doing lots of plyometric training, and my body's feeling very sore. My knees are really sore, which is a sign of my age, but something I'm learning how to do. And it does take a lot of hard work. As you said, Alana, I totally relate to that.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. It's a sporting theme to get us kicked off. So that's great. And I guess just a couple of housekeeping items as well. So obviously we're recording today's session. We will be following up with everyone sharing the recording. So for those unable to join today, but also any resources that might come up in our conversation, we'll share those with you. And I have my trusty colleague from Mentorloop, Grace, here in the chat and moderating today, helping us out. So as we move through the conversation, feel free to chat. Put your questions in the chat, and we're happy to take those questions in the flow of the discussion. And so let's get to it, because that's why we're here. What is even future-proofing? And so I think when I hear this statement, which I'm sure we're all familiar with this being bandied around, it's such a big topic. But I jump straight to thinking about talent. Like, how can I ensure my people of today have the skills for the future? And I think we all have a natural tendency to jump to solution mode. But when the topic's this big, it's like, kind of, where do you start? It's a bit like probably eating an elephant. So I want to pause and ask ourselves, like, if we're going to plan for the future, do we even really know what's going to be in the future? And so when we think about that, Alana, gonna throw the big spicy topic out there. Just like, is future proofing your workforce actually achievable?
No.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe I'm being controversial right off the start line. Look, I think it is such a huge topic, and I'm thrilled we're having the conversation, because I think everyone that I'm working with and talking with that are in the people space, or business leaders, are thinking about this very topic, right? We've got the rate of change in our world is astronomical, right? And so we're asking ourselves this question of like, how the hell do we keep up with it all? And I think there's this kind of sentiment of we don't feel like we can keep up, right? Chris, I don't know what adds you would put to that.
Yeah, I think future proofing is really hard. I think that for a long time we've been really comfortable in certainty, and businesses have kind of grown up with that. You know, that's how we've all been taught, is to have a plan, to have a Gantt chart. Well, the Gantt chart was invented years ago.
I haven't heard about a Gantt chart for a while. That's great.
Well,
It
they're
looks
still being
good.
used,
Yeah.
Heidi. They're still inside so many organizations. That's how we plan for work. It's like, what's our deliverable? Where's it going?
Yep.
Let's work back from that. And usually, you know, most projects just do not follow that sort of sequential process. And strategy is a very similar process. You can have an ambition, and there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, with ambition, whether it be for talent, whether it be for organizational markets that you want to conquer, products that you want to get out. Ambition is fantastic, but I think it falls over when you're thinking about, we're going to achieve this by this time and know all the answers. I think businesses that are doing that are kind of struggling because things are just coming at you so fast and you don't know really how to respond. That causes, a lot in an organization that we've all seen in terms of needing to follow the plan, because we said we're going to follow this plan, even in the face of clear umbrellas that are working against that. So, you know, I've seen really good examples with even like succession planning. And we can maybe talk about some of these happening of what specific examples are coming up in organizations, but where you put someone down on a succession plan and then the next month that person's actually resigned. So these sort of
some of the
future-proofing concepts
that are coming into it by trying to stay ahead of the game. And I guess, you know, it's I'm not worried, but I'm thinking, why is this such an obsession now? You know, there's a lot of rapid change out there. You know, obviously technology plays a big part of this, but what are some of the driving principles that you're seeing behind the conversations that are coming from you that, you know, is driving that conversation around, we need to get ready? What do we need to be doing? Like, what's the next thing we need to be thinking about? What is it? Is it fear? Is it industry trends?
Yeah, I think it's a number of things that kind of come into play for organization. I think we look at what's happening globally, and you know, there's this idea of kind of needing to keep up. I think also it's about staying ahead of the competition, right? You know, how do we make sure that our business is sustainable and we continue to grow and we outpace our competitors? And I think there's a reality of technology, right? And we're not here to talk about AI, but we know the impact that, you know, AI is going to have, you know, on our workforce. And so there's this idea of, you know, how do we stay a little bit ahead of the curve? So I think there's all these kind of competing factors that come into play for organizations to be saying, hey, look, it just makes good business sense that we try and get a little bit ahead of the curve. I think there are some challenges, though, in terms of how organizations are potentially approaching that. And I think this is where we see this kind of mixed response around, you know, future proofing versus future building.
Yeah. And I think, you know, technology is a good example, because I think there has been a rush of organizations to go and invest heavily in tech, and then they're expecting, you know, a payback. Where's the ROI on this? But if we don't have, you know, we've got to make these investments in these new shiny things, but we're still lagging, or we haven't adjusted our processes or given the proper training to people, you know, is this a friction we are seeing that that has probably, well, maybe been an impetus to get ahead of this, and technology's the solution here, but we're not maybe ready internally for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I see plenty of examples where the rush to have something has meant that perhaps we've introduced a tool, a platform that we're not maximizing, we're not getting the return on investment, versus that actually stopping and pausing and understanding what are the problems we're solving for, where are the opportunities in our business, and what makes sense on that basis for our business, right? I think there's this great debate around skills at the moment, which is, do we understand, are we mapping for the skills we think we need in the future, or actually do we understand the work that needs to be done in our business, and therefore, because we understand the work, that drives the skill? I think they're a little bit around the wrong way in some organizations.
Chris, do you want to jump in there? Like, are you in conversations you're having, and maybe there's around, that succession planning piece, or even job design, like how do we keep up with this rapid pace of change, when systems and processes are maybe lagging?
It's such a really good question. I think there's two different elements of this. I think in an organization, there's things that are happening, which is around expectations to deliver. I think, if you're a CFO, you're watching how you're performing against that quarterly number. That happens in the sales. The commercial officer is sort of looking at that. Everyone's sort of looking at this quarterly focus. So I think expectation to deliver, it kind of drives this. We want to protect. We want to look to the future and make sure we've got plans, which is all fine. I think planning is okay. But I think where it falls in is we become addicted to not living in our present. And I think that would be more at an individual level rather than the sort of collective.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's both. But one pattern I sort of see in myself, which is I want to think about what the next stage is before the current stage is complete. So I think we've grown up in a culture of measurement where we're comparing ourselves to the scorecard, and we're used to that type of work, and that's how we reward ourselves, that's how we perform, that's how we measure everything. The present moment is where we can really make change, though, in our business and in ourselves. And if we underestimate our need for certainty, our need to be addicted to the future, rather than facing into what are our customers saying right now, what are our people saying right now? What do we need right now to be able to service in the best possible way?
And I think, it's an interesting one. And we had this in our earlier discussion, this came up where, one of you mentioned that, there's a lot of work that goes into putting together these strategic plans, strategic reviews, here's the roadmap. But then by the time it also goes through that internal, approval process, it's out of date. So then the challenge for HR and people teams is we're left with something that's put back to us to implement, but is it even relevant anymore? Like, is it, is this a reoccurring theme that we're seeing, that tension between leadership, the time lag, and then the problem kind of being left with people teams to solve?
Yeah. I think it is. I think I've observed that being inside an organisation, sort of seeing that pattern emerge, and the need to deliver and need to go against that plan. I think our preference, like if we talk about performance, because that's ultimately, you want to move fast, you want to move with speed, you want to execute, and really that's a performance conversation. That's in that model. There's two types of performance, right? There's tactical performance, which is you've got to deliver against the result, against the policy, against the process, against the strategy. And then there's the adaptive, which is diverging away from those plans that you've set. Yeah. And typically the pattern I see is that we're a lot more comfortable in the tactical.
Yep.
And we're less comfortable in space and in uncertainty and in changing dynamics than we are in the tactical. And I think that's not a fault of our own. It's just a human, perhaps an observation. But if we could go a little bit further, it's probably a human preference is to have more certainty. And so the performance is probably skewed so much towards tactical performance, delivering on that KPI,
people
then
want
diverging
outcomes.
from it.
I totally get that. Absolutely. Like that's where I default to as well. Alana, something to add?
Yeah, look, I echo all of those sentiments. I think the other layering on that is that because of that certainty, we'd rather stick to plan, right? And I think what we want to suggest today in this conversation is perhaps how do we start to encourage adaptability skills so that actually we encourage in organizations someone to say, I'm doing this work, actually, maybe it's not making sense. How do I need to change it? What conversations do I need to have? Does it need to look different? So that actually that's where we read what's happening around us, right? It's that kind of sense making ability is, how do we foster that in organizations so that at an individual level, the one thing I can do is kind of pop my head up and say, oh, like I'm looking at what's going on in market, even though I'm doing this, I'm seeing this trend. Like, who do I talk to so we get ahead of it? I think often we look to the same people to solve problems in organizations. And in fact, actually, the people that know the answers the best are generally the ones that are doing the work day to day. And so rather than, it be a people team, it be a group of leaders, it be the exec team, is how are we actually galvanizing around the individuals that are at the kind of forefront of the work and saying, what are you seeing? What are you sensing that, perhaps your work is changing? What insights can we gather from that? And therefore, because we know all of this, what might we do differently? How do we co-design with them, right, and involve them in the solution?
Well, I think that's a nice segue here. We've confirmed that you can't future-proof entirely. It's not something that we can achieve, so we'll just put a line through that. But it's not all lost. It's not all lost.
No.
We can break this down, and that's why I'm keen to unpack, like, what are some even small incremental changes we can start to look at that are achievable, but do maybe move the needle, even still on, that tactical stuff. We can still drive towards an outcome in the short term. And so I think in some of the reading I've been doing around this topic, the consistent themes that kind of are coming up are we almost need to throw out the rule book and rethink learning entirely. And, it's not a new concept, but coming back to creating lifelong learners. And I think we can think about this just in terms of even looking at, kind of university degree stats and, that at an all-time line in terms of people, opting into university, but also the dropout rate, in terms of non-completion of degrees. And so it's not that people don't want to learn anymore. There's just a variety of the ways that people can learn, and if, you talk about learning how to dunk, Chris, or, that's something you can go and Google yourself and figure out through YouTube about some techniques like that. Like, learning is very accessible. And so I'm curious, to switch the conversation to, what are some things that are working, and think about, what's this next phase then? What can we actually practically do as people teams and start to look at? What's maybe the first thing we can go and have a look at, Alana?
I want to talk about power skills,
yes,
not soft skills. It infuriates me when I hear someone call it soft skills because they're the hardest freaking damn skills to learn in your whole life, right? And I think when you nail them, they are your power skills, right? Here we're talking about empathy, sense making, adaptability, curiosity, all of these great things that if we nail that as a skill set, that is our superpower, right? It's a thing that actually enables us to transfer to every single role that we do in organizations. And I think that's where we need to start. So what I will say is, if you're in a highly technical role, absolutely, we obviously need to stay across what any kind of skill development is required in that space. But I think if we were actually to spend time and effort and energy on lifting these power skills in organizations, lifting, natural curiosity. I hear so many organizations that say, we want a learning culture. My favorite quote is, every system is designed perfectly for the result it gets.
Yeah,
so if you're not getting a learning culture, if that's what you want, you haven't designed for it. So the question is how do you create spaces in the flow of your work that foster what you want more of, right? So as an example, let's say that is, we want a learning culture. In your team meeting, do you even ask the question, what have you learnt this week? You know, how do we, in small spaces, at your all hands, how do you talk
Yeah.
about what have we learnt this week as an organization? You know, that we as humans, we look for signals and cues, right, to kind of give us this direction of what matters to our organization. And so if the organization is signaling that learning matters, we're going to talk about it a lot, we're going to create spaces to talk about it a lot, then I go, oh, this is important. What am I doing about it? And I think this is where perhaps we potentially overcomplicate this space, right? Is I'm a big fan of saying, what is the smallest version of whatever it is that you're trying to do that you can do in your business? And how do you just create space for it? Because everyone's busy, and space within your existing operating rhythm. Don't start a new meeting. Don't do another all hands. Like, how do you use the spaces you have to really foster that desire for learning more?
Yeah, what's your MVP here? But I think that's a really achievable thing, to bring in those bite-sized learnings. And, you know, I think when we hear terms like, let's create a culture of learning, or a culture of X, or a culture of Y, you know, it's like it's not, it's kind of the outcome of other things. Like, how do we get there? So Chris, anything else to add there as well?
I really loved what you just said there, Heidi, around let's create the culture, like do it. It would be the starting point.
Yeah.
Start closest in. It's a beautiful poet by David White. It's a poem about starting really close to the next step. Like, don't think about the plan 12 months from now of where you want to be with your culture. Do an experiment, get something happening that you could do next week. Start closest in. But just to add to that, I think you could almost design, like in this way, a bit of a blueprint. Like a blueprint for this adaptable organization is looking at the skills. I love what you've said, Alana, in terms of those skills. But how do you make decisions? Like, how are decisions made? One pattern I've sort of seen in organizations is there's these investment committees. And so a team will identify something, and they'll be like, oh, we've got to solve for this thing. It's going to take a little bit of money. Maybe it's 10K, it's 20K. It could be even larger than that. But then that funding request has to go to someone, and then they'll take it to an investment committee. And by the time it gets to the next meeting, if it's able to get raised in that meeting, it's probably 2 or 3 months from lag. So that's just one really good example of where you're trying to future-proof your investment process, but it's not really keeping up with what your team's seeing on the ground.
Yeah.
And so taking an example like that, how could you get people making decisions in a lot more adaptable way? There's this practice called participatory governance. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Oh, I haven't heard this one.
Participatory governance. And so the idea is that anyone in your team can raise an idea. And anyone in the team can raise an idea, and then there's a governance session that you have to hear those ideas out. And what you're looking for, and typically what happens in that, is a consensus sort of model, right?
Yep.
Like, do we all think this is the right thing to do?
Yeah.
We could flip that on a switch and say, actually, it's about consent. Do you consent to this idea going ahead, even though you might not consent, have full agreement that it's the right thing to do, but are you willing to learn from it? Are you willing to get behind it? So participatory governance is a really interesting sort of concept in this work of how do you invite, anyone can raise one of these suggestions. You might set up, people from different teams to participate. We did this at OUA, Open University Australia, where we had taken that sort of concept and built it into our strategy and planning sessions so that the teams could come to the strategy sessions, hear what's going on, and contribute to the next ideas that they were going after. So it's really practical.
This also breeds, and it's not a theme we're sort of unpacking today, but that psychological safety, bringing everyone in, feeling that they can contribute. And I think we need to start with that as a baseline. So you do have that I guess, environment where your people are feeling comfortable in bringing ideas, bringing their whole selves to work. And so we do get that creative thinking and diverse perspective coming to the table. And I think when, I mean, I'm a bit old fashioned, I've been around the traps for a while now, and I love, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and other, old school frameworks like that. But, when I hear all of this and you talk to like, not soft skills, power skills,
Yes.
And I love that because, obviously with mentoring, these are the skills that we are often, helping to build and influence and bring out in people. But I mean, are we seeing a pivot back to the 70-20-10 model? Is this back in vogue? Is this what we need to be thinking about?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not sure that it's ever gone out of fashion. I think we've probably just shown it in different ways. I think this idea of experiential and social learning is fundamental. And for a couple of reasons. I think let's look at the leadership role at the moment, right? Like, talk about having a hell of a lot to do. There is so much overwhelm in that management level in our organization. I know there are plenty of people kind of looking up now going, kind of not sure that I want that gig, right? Seems pretty full on at the moment. And so the idea with this social learning is, how do you use people around you, right? Mentoring is a great example of that. But how do you use this idea of putting people, into, I do lots of coaching circles in the work that I do, because there is so much collective intelligence in organizations that we don't utilize, right? We're always looking to a handful of people, typically our leader, and then maybe there's kind of a couple of people in our direct team. But there is a huge opportunity to really embrace this idea of experiential social learning, to foster, right, what we want more of. And the neuroscience actually behind this is really cool, right? Because one thing that happens when we work closely with people is we have this kind of like positive emotional reaction, right? And what happens in our brains is particularly the amygdala, right, which is crucial for kind of memory formation. It triggers all of these beautiful neurotransmitters, all those happy hormones, right? And when we feel these happy hormones, we trust, we are motivated, right? Our attention kind of increases. And so the evidence actually tells us that learning experiences that engage this emotion, people remember the stuff more, right? Like, so just from a memory perspective, and, think about, I'm sure you've both had experiences where you have learned something with someone and you've had a great time, and it sticks, right? You kind of remember it. So I think, moving away from that idea of like information-based learning, the like shoving content down the fire hose at people, and really saying, how do we actually, do this social learning is critical for sustainable learning in organizations.
It's something we often sort of preach at Mentorloop in terms of what is mentoring and what is it not. It is about sharing experience, not advice. And that's got to be in the context also of, thinking about people right now want to know how to get from A to B. It isn't like the A to Z of like mapping out my full, journey here. It's, I think the stat now is people are going to have 5 different career pathways, not jobs, pathways in their life of work. And so that is so disruptive that we need to be just thinking about what are those small incremental changes that I just need to get from A to B along here. So, I mean, curious about, this switch, the language is, it's not future proofing, it's creating, a future fit sort of workforce. Chris, any strategies that come to mind around, I guess that how that ties into that experiential or social learning as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I might touch on that. I also just wanted to pick up your question around the 70-20-10, because I share a slightly
we can go
different
back to that
view as well.
Yep, go for it.
Which is, I think it's 100%. Learn a business, particularly. Actually, it probably extends. Doesn't matter if you're a startup or an enterprise. I think learning has to be 100% of what you do. Learning has to be part of your strategy of your business. How you're learning what your customers need, what the market's telling you. That's a learning piece.
Yeah.
How your people develop. So I actually kind of feel differently about 70-20-10 because it implies a box of percentage of time. I think everything is learning, so practically, what could that look like? It's, I think, thinking about 3 things that I try to introduce in the learning practices that I work with. So as Alana said, peer support, kind of that buddying process is super important. That's not the manager. That's someone else. And being really deliberate about who you're paired up with builds trust, as you said, Alana. That's a really key principle. The second one is the practices. What rituals, what processes do you have in place to build that quick learning practice in? A Monday meeting is a great way to start the week and say, what experiments do we want to try this week? How are we tracking against what we've said we're going to do? What's the experiments we want to run for the next couple of weeks and see, and then getting teams back together at the end of the week to review that, I think is really great. And then the third part is edge. And this is the stuff that's a little bit like what you were saying, Heidi. Everyone wants to go from A to B. They've got these career ambitions. Where are you giving them real feedback in that process of how they're going in that experience, how they're showing up? And I think we leave feedback for this end of year process or a process. It's not. It's got to be in the moment as things come up, as we all know. We all know this, but it doesn't get systemized.
Yes.
It doesn't. We leave it to a technology solution maybe, but the feedback process in itself gets left to a process. It needs to be part of a practice, I think. So development edge, trust, practices are the three kind of things that I've and there's some really great reading from deliberately developmental organizations. It's a book called DDO by Lisa Leahy and Bob Keegan, which is really great to sort of flesh out those three dimensions I've spoken to.
I'm just going to jump to a question that I've got in the chat that's sort of relevant to this conversation here. So either Alana or Chris, feel free to jump in, but we've got Deepak here. Hi, Deepak. Is there a piece of learning in particular that has continued to help you through change in your careers?
A great question. I would say it's more of a practice than a learning. I often talk about reflection being a superpower. And I think what's interesting in the world we live that we react more than we reflect, right? Think about the way that we kind of consume content. Everything is kind of pushed to us and we're reacting to that. And actually our brains need this beautiful time of reflection, of kind of pausing and consolidating, right? There's a generative element of that our brains need to do every single night. And one thing that I have been really deliberate about is intention setting at the start of the week. So kind of similar, Chris, to the practice that you talk about, like what experiments, do I want to embark on? But actually, what just do I want out of my week, right? And I ask myself, what's something I'm really proud of? What's my focus for this week? What's one thing I do that steps me closer toward that focus? And then on a Friday, I check in on that and kind of go, how did I do? Did I get the things done? Did I step closer to my focus? And I'm really deliberate about doing that. I do it, I journal it every morning, and it is such an ingrained habit now. And I think that becomes your superpower, right? Because it is bringing that level of self-awareness to the forefront. I often use the analogy of like sporting teams. What sporting team plays a game on a weekend and then the following weekend they go out on the field without having had a conversation about their performance? No one I know, right? They've probably analysed, they've probably rewatched the video, they've analysed every move they've made, they've had feedback from their coach, from assistant coaches, all of the things. Yet when we think about our individual performance, we don't necessarily put that same practice around ourselves. And I think, my piece of advice to everyone is always, if you can become really diligent about that, then that is a true superpower skill.
Chris?
Oh, it's hard to get it down to a particular piece. I'm sort of struggling with that. I think just probably being comfortable to, I don't know all the answers and putting my ego away is probably been the most helpful thing that I'm still trying to figure out, to be honest, is how do you just accept that where you've got gaps and being aware of those, as you said, Alana, is a super important practice. That's really helped, and I've been digging a lot into more around presencing and that type of consciousness work, which I've found really helpful in my career and just acceptance of my life, I guess, which has been great.
Yeah, I think, for me, sometimes you think about learning too literally, like, what is this course I've done, or what is this thing I'm focusing on improving? But we can actually, start to acknowledge it in other ways, and I guess, feel better about ourselves in that we are opening ourselves up to learning opportunities. And I think, it could be through those small changes in how we approach a meeting, being present, not starting with
absolutely.
no, but maybe asking why instead of no. There's things like that we can change. And I guess what that comes back to again is these power skills, and I shouldn't do this
Yeah.
because that like that devalues it, I feel, where it should be like power skills like this.
Yeah, correct.
So, when we think about power skills, and if you're running a team and you're seeing some of these skills missing, what are you wanting to upskill people in terms of adaptability, curiosity? What are like the hero power skills for you guys?
Yeah, I think one hero power skill is vulnerability, and there's a couple of dimensions to this. It's really well known that we should do it. Like Brené Brown's obviously spoken a lot about it, and there's been a lot of messaging about it in workplaces around the power of it. I think there's a personal part of that, like not knowing something invites other people in to your orbit, and that induces a whole bunch of like really good feeling stuff for people, particularly if you're a leader. And if you're a leader and you ask your team, "Hey, I really don't know how to do this, I'd love some help," they're going to be like so motivated to want to help you. So I feel like vulnerability is probably the one that I would be my number one go-to in
I
this
say
way.
that to my team all the time. I don't know how to do this.
Well, that's awesome. I'm sure they love that, right? Like they
Yeah.
absolutely love it. And asking for help in that process is still something I've I think continually trying to evolve in my practice. The second one I was going to add in that is this idea of experimentation. And those two things really go hand in hand. Without vulnerability, you can't create a culture of experimentation and trying stuff. So allowing for failure and how you do that, building experimentation in as a practice would be probably my number two.
Great. Alana?
Yeah, love those. I would start with acceptance as a power skill. And the reason being is I think that a lot of what we spend time and effort and energy on are actually things that are not in our control. And we want to control it because of the whole certainty piece, that we talked about, but so much actually is not within our control. And I think if you have a skill that is able in those moments to identify, is what I'm worrying about in my control? And if it's not, accepting that it's not and moving on, that is insanely beneficial actually to your well-being, right? One of the things we see a lot around burnout is that this ruminating on things that aren't in my control is a real big contributor to burnout. So I think acceptance, and I just think that's a wild superpower. And Brené Brown, she says you ask yourself these when you have this freak out moment, you ask yourself two questions. Will freaking out help? And can I do anything about it? And I think there's such great prompts, right? To be able to say, can I accept it and just move on? The second one for me is curiosity. And I'll say it until the day I die, because I just think if you can always be so open to the possibility of not knowing the answer, the possibility of what it could be, and have the curiosity to ask those questions, then I just think it unlocks things like vulnerability, right? It unlocks all of those opportunities because you're not coming in with any kind of set of expectation. So that would be my two.
Amazing. So it wouldn't be a Mentorloop webinar without sort of, a conversation looping this all back to mentoring in some way. But I think it is highly relevant here. So this isn't the sales pitch or anything like that. But, I think when we obviously see organizations often coming to us about they're wanting to start a mentoring program, but a hesitation of, do we have the knowledge? Do we have the expertise in-house to be able to do this? But I think that there is this tendency to think about mentoring just on the hard skills or the technical skills side of things. But actually, if we think about the power skills, everyone in every organization has this skill set there. In terms of like strategies, you mentioned also coaching circles that you operate in, Alana, but what are some actual initiatives that people could look at implementing to help with that internal transfer of power skills and upskilling people in this area?
Yeah, I think a couple that I love that I think work really well, because as you all know, sometimes when people enter into a mentoring relationship, they can start with like, oh God, what do we talk about first? Where do we even start, right? And sometimes getting started can be the hardest part. And so I love kind of framing people to say, why don't you take a particular decision that you had to make recently to your conversation with someone and just see what other perspective would they have on that decision that you made, whether you were happy with the decision or not. But actually, there is so much to learn from actually just someone thinking differently to us, right? What were the questions they asked themselves as they went through that decision-making process? So this kind of idea of like case studies, being really valuable for learning. The thing that I'm always really conscious of when it comes to these examples is the more relevant and real that you can make it in someone's context, the more likely they are to engage in the learning, right? So the good old kind of examples that feel so far-fetched, it's like, a feedback conversation between Homer and Marge Simpson, knock your socks off. People are like, really? Like, that's kind of not really part of my day-to-day. Unless you're Homer and Marge, then go for it. Rather than actually, this was a real problem that actually our business had to navigate recently, go, right? So I love that idea of, that kind of case study role playing, but it's all really relevant in that person's context.
Nice. Yeah, I really love those examples. I think the add to those would be tying it into the development edge. So I've mentioned sort of edge before. Getting people some sort of tool just to help them be aware of what that is, whether it be 360 feedback, some sort of feedback input, so that when you're starting that mentoring process, people are really clear on what they want to get out of it and what the organization sort of is sharing with them and what those observations are. I think that then fuels the opportunity for growth, because when you become aware of something, then you can do something about it. A lot of the time, what I notice is sometimes mentoring programs don't start off well because there isn't the edge at the start. And so there's no impetus to really change. And that creates this mentoring process, which is just really soft. And there's not really a hard kind of feedback process in that. And it doesn't need to be, rude, or it doesn't need to be arrogant. It needs to be safe. Psychological safety is a massive part of that process, but it needs to be edgy enough. Otherwise, people are not going to get the value from it, and they're not going to keep committed to it in the long term. I've seen programs start and they last about 3 months where there's not that rigor behind it, and people revert back to safety. So you've got to keep fueling it with these little edge cases of things for people to try. And my other ad would be experimentation. Again, I keep coming back to that.
Yeah.
But I think that's a massive part, and holding enough tension that they have to try something as part of the process. Like, it has to be part of their role to take that mentoring learning into their work, particularly when we're talking about that more vertical self-development than the horizontal technical development. But I mean, I just had I've got a really close someone I would say is a friend, but also work friend. And I was just on the phone to him before, just I've got to do the, could do this session. And it's just real honest with me. And it's like, you can do it, and giving me some advice. And those sort of conversations you cannot put a dollar value on. And if you can systemize that edge in that practice of honesty, this is where I'm at, and creating that safety with those people, that is so powerful beyond the technical, I think.
Yeah. And part of the challenge is just opting in sometimes, which comes back to that, that skill of the power skill of vulnerability. So, you can see they're all kind of stacked. You kind of need one to fall to the others, to the others 100%. To open up to. We had a Mentorloop week recently where we brought the whole team together. And one thing I took away from that as well, because it was great to step out of your day to day and, have a chance to sort of be vulnerable, experiment with, not only different ideas, but intersect with people that you don't normally day to day interact with. But one of the facilitators came out with that the outcome at the end of that was, this saying around wisdom, what I say and do differently on Monday, and being intentional about it too. So I think with all of these things, it is about like, what's the thing I might change or adapt or try and do differently? And it's not about putting huge pressure on ourselves, but I think that's a nice way to maybe intention. You still need some intention there. And that gets us back to the tactical, practical part where we're comfortable. We can all go and implement something after this as well.
That's right. And I think if I can also add to that, I think we talk about this future proofing, future building, right? And I think that there are a lot of leaders in organizations that, you know, kind of worry, will I have what I need at the point in time in which whatever is kind of going on around for their organization kind of hits, right? It's this kind of readiness factor. And I often say, you know, to my clients, like, if your people aren't learning and growing, then your business isn't. Like, it's a really simple kind of math equation, right? So if you commit to the learning and growth of everyone in your organization, then guess what? That has a direct correlation to the growth of your organization. And so sometimes actually just trying to simplify, like, what are we building for? Well, actually, if we just want to build readiness for our future, what does that look like? And yes, of course, you know, there's the whole skills debate, and we're not negating that isn't a part of this.
Yes.
But I think often we look to have the beautiful polished version of what it is that we need, and that gets in the way of us just taking really small action.
Yeah.
I think I may have mentioned in one of our lead up calls, you know, I often, when I go into organizations and talk about, you know, how do you define learning? You know, there's such a broad definition for how people consider what learning means to them. There's everything from, I've done the big course, I've read the book, I've watched the TED talk, I've listened to the podcast, right? But actually, what if you just use a definition of, I know something today that I didn't know yesterday? How would that change the conversation organizationally that you would have about what you're learning and how you share
100%.
that learning? It, you know, it puts a really different kind of perspective on, you know, the things we pay attention to when it comes to how we tell stories about learning and all that good stuff.
I was just going to add to that, Lana. I think you've almost hit a pattern in some ways for me, a little trigger. So, where when you were talking about that sort of that process of like consuming, you know, of like, I've read the podcast, I've read all of that, and then there's something that just doesn't happen, which is the action. And I heard this really great quote from Small Giants Academy. They're talking about like, wisdom without action is irrelevance. And it just struck a chord for me when you were talking about that. I feel like if you don't actually put into practice the things that you're learning and trying things, there's no point consuming all that stuff.
Absolutely.
It's not going to make a difference in your business. So I think you've got to take that action. And I think that's where mentoring can play a role. It's like, well, okay, you consumed all that stuff. What have you done about it? And it's holding up a little bit of a mirror. I'm not sure if that's consistent with the definition you've got, Heidi, as
no, absolutely.
From Mentorloop,
absolutely.
but I think that's the beautiful role that mentoring can play in this equation.
Well, I think that's a nice place to pause and talking about the next steps and the actions. We'll get to some questions. So got one here from Trevor. So coming back to, I guess, that the overarching topic of future proofing, where do tools like block charts, flow charts, scope fit into future proofing for business development management, and will these answer future planning needs? So, you know, what I think Trevor might be alluding to, what are still some, you know, just basics or tools or processes we might have been utilizing that are still relevant for this next phase?
Yeah, I think we still need a plan, right? But I think the question is how flexible and adaptable are we prepared to be when it comes to the plan? What are those inflection moments where we're sensing that something is changing, that perhaps we need to have a conversation that kind of checks in and says, hey, is the plan still the right plan? Or does part of this plan need to adjust? So I think what we're not saying is that there's no place for structure. There absolutely needs to be structure in this regard. But I think the question is at what points, you know, in the evolution of your planning and implementation, do you stop and just ask yourself, do we need to adjust anything? Are we still on the right path? That's my view. Chris, I don't know if you've got a different view.
No, I think people would people really struggle without some structure in place there, and I know you don't want chaos without it. So it's a bit of a balance there, but I think being intentional with how you plan. So maybe rather than having the 12-month project plan, you have you set up your structure so it's a monthly review. You plan at the start of the month, you review it, and you learn, what do we need to change for next month? If you could do that and set an expectation with your peers and the people that you need to work with, that, hey, this is how we're going to plan. This is your opportunity to provide feedback. that's just a really small example where you can build adaptability into your planning process. At a more strategic level, I've seen a really great framework being used where you actually call out bets that you're making. These are innovations that you want to try that you don't know if it's going to work. It's a bet. So you could use just even in the language that you might adopt, it lends itself to a little bit more adaptability in that way. So it doesn't mean you're throwing everything out, just change some wording and some language and intentionality, to your point, Heidi, intention with how you can adopt that too.
Yeah, I love that.
I've got one here on AI, which I'm just going to sort of paraphrase here because we've kind of touched on it, but it is, you know, high on people's agenda, and I think there's an element of fear about AI and, you know, taking people's jobs. But, you know, I heard something the other day. It's the people that will be vulnerable is the people that don't learn to adapt to how they use AI in their role. And so on that, you know, what if we're thinking more about technical capability around technology, are you seeing any examples of companies, you know, thinking about how they upskill, you know, at scale their people in how they utilize AI?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing an interest of education, you know, like, and the ethical considerations, and, you know, how do we want to use it in our business, and where are the right spaces? I think there is a huge opportunity to, you know, kind of a point at the start of our conversation where we actually ask ourselves, like, understand the work, right? Because let's be honest, we all want to do meaningful work. We all want to do work that makes us feel good, that we grow as a result of doing. And so if we understand the work in our organizations, we understand the opportunities where could AI play a role here that actually means it creates space for people to do more add value work that is very much human centered. And I think there's not as many that are kind of playing in that space. I think we're starting to see some organizations embark on that work. That is obviously a huge task in itself, right? Again, a huge fan of piloting, you know, doing small experiments in organizations. But I'm seeing a lot around the education space. Less in that, how do we understand the role that it needs to play in our organization? But I think, and I know I'm broadly generalizing. So for anyone who's on the call where you're like, hey, our organization, we've done this and we're amazing, I apologize. You are amazing if you have done that.
Share with us what you've done.
And share with us what you've done. Absolutely.
Culture of learning.
Exactly.
Chris, anything to add on that big topic of AI?
I'm not sure I'm the best to talk about it at the moment. I'm still learning it myself. I think the approach that I've seen is kind of creating guilds of practices of learning around it so far. And then obviously there's companies that are looking at, well, what roles, what skills, what jobs to be done can AI supplement? And I haven't done a heap of that work within organizations yet. I'm still seeing them sort of play on the edge of, let's see where the possibility is, as opposed to, all right, now we're taking jobs. I haven't seen that. So, you know, the sort of felt sense I can understand of why people would be worried about that. But I actually haven't seen that in practice and in reality yet. I think it's much more been alongside so far. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I'm conscious of time here and wanting to get to wrap up, but I mean, there was a little bit of doom and gloom at the start. You know, we can't predict the future. Who knew? And we can't solve for it. But what is something that you're optimistic about, Alana and Chris, just in terms of what this next phase as a people leader looks like? Like, what is something you're excited about now? You get the opportunity to actually work on customers with because this uncomfortable change is coming. What opportunities is it opening up that you're excited about?
Yeah, I think I'm seeing a lot more organizations invest in the learning for their people and really commit to actually just this acknowledgement of if our people aren't growing, then we're not growing as an organization. And that excites me, right? Because I think as soon as we feel like we know everything, then we're not growing and our organizations aren't growing. So yeah, that's exciting me for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely not all doom and gloom. Hey, like I think there's organizations looking to be different to really stand out from the market. And I think those are the ones that are sort of, I've noticed, accelerating. Just yesterday, I was talking to a senior leader who was saying they wanted to embrace more vulnerability I was encouraged by that. I think vulnerability is becoming more acceptable. I think it's going to show really great leadership in today's context of everything that's happening in the world. If we can continue that, I think it was really refreshing to see a commercial business thinking about vulnerability as a skill set. I was like, oh, this is cool. This is the type of work I want to be doing. So that was encouraging.
Well, lovely. Well, look, thank you both for taking time out of your busy days to spend chatting with me today. I think it's been, a really interesting and robust discussion. Thank you to all those that joined. I always say, hopefully there's one key takeaway that you can take away and start thinking about, and hopefully it's been a worthwhile session. But we'll follow up by the end of this week in terms of the recording and some of those resources that we've also referenced during the call, as well as our respective contact details. If anyone did need to get in touch, we're happy to have a further conversation and unpack anything in more detail. So thank you all for dialing in today. It's been fun, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a great
everyone.
week.